am so thrilled to be here with all of you to share the new rules of resilience, thriving in an uncertain and virtual world as part of the Biohacking and Health Hacking Summit. I am Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal. I am the founder and CEO of Resilience Leadership, and it is my honor to share with you the work that I've been conducting over the course of the past decade to understand what are the key behaviors and practices that are actually associated with resilience in leadership and in life. It really all started with just one question. You see, I grew up in a home where on one side of our living room, we had a Merriam-Webster dictionary that was about 1.5 feet thick with every conceivable word in the English language. And on the other side of the living room, we had a full complement of Encyclopedia Britannicas, courtesy of my paternal grandparents, where you could look up any concept that you wanted to understand about the world. But between those two sources, when I looked up resilience, I couldn't understand what it was. When I looked up the word resilient, it said to demonstrate resilience. And when I looked up the word resilience, it said to be resilient. But it didn't tell me quite how to do it. In the Encyclopedia Britannicas, I saw examples of life forms that were resilient, of symbiotic relationships. But yet again, I didn't know how to apply this to my own life. And so over a decade ago, I struck out on my own, and I started with one simple but powerful question. And that is, when you've faced challenge in the past, even significant challenge, what have you done to effectively address that challenge? I've now asked this question of hundreds of leaders and collected thousands of pieces of data to understand when we effectively address challenge, when we show up in the world and allow ourselves to be resilient, what is typically or truly happening behind the scenes? Now, there's a couple of words here that are intentional. Effectively address challenge. See, so often we talk about overcoming challenge, and yet I don't think we overcome challenge. I think challenge has the propensity to overcome us. Very few times in my life and in the lives of the people that I've interviewed have people said they've overcome challenge. Instead, we limp, we walk, we crawl toward the finish line, and oftentimes there's not a single victorious moment. The second piece of language that's intentional here is this idea of challenge. We talk about adversity and obstacles as though things are all negative or maybe all positive. But what challenge does is it allows us to appreciate the nuance of our experience. That typically everything that we face is not purely negative or purely positive, but a mix of both. And challenge allows us to account for both the benefits and the loss, the positive and the negative that's inherent in every challenge that we face. And I want to tell you the story of Nelson. So Nelson is a little boy who grew up in a rural town. He was the first one of his family to go to school. His family was largely illiterate and practiced polygamy. But Nelson always had a flair for education. And in fact, he found himself at the close of his high school career, after his mother had passed away, and he was sent to live with relatives and hadn't seen his father in years. He found himself being eligible to attend university. And so he attended his first year of university, but fell in with a crowd that the university didn't approve of. And Nelson was suspended or expelled following his last semester of university. On his way home back to his family, he got wind that his father's approach for straightening Nelson out was going to be to have the boy married. Because getting married, isn't that the balm, the cure for all men who are in discovery? Well, Nelson didn't want to get married as a young man, and so rather than returning home, he fled to a nearby town. He was homeless for a period of time. He took on odd jobs, and during that period of time, he very much did not have a grounded or landing place. And if we think about a young man who hasn't completed his education, who is homeless to some extent, who doesn't have a strong social network, who isn't connected with his family, we often think that the prospects for this person are not strong. But the story of Nelson is the story of Nelson Mandela, a man that we often think of as a paragon or as an iconic example of resilience. And I tell you this story about resilience for two reasons. One, to demonstrate that resilience is something that we collect over time, and that facing challenge is not occurring in the absence of being resilient, but truly part of our formation and maturation. And the second reason that I tell you this story is that oftentimes we're ashamed of the challenges that we face, or we think that because certain things have happened in our lives, we can't possibly rise to the occasion and be the person that we want to be the leader that we want to be. But resilience isn't about where you start. Resilience is about where you end. And Nelson Mandela is a beautiful example, beautiful illustrative example of that. Why is resilience important? Well, in the midst of what we're facing from a global health crisis, a pandemic, large-scale economic change, and in some cases even collapse or the threat of collapse, looking at the fabric of our society being stretched and pulled and the threads of injustice and inequity, we can really think about resilience as being the fundamental element of the human operating system that is critical now more than ever in the environment that we live and work within. I have a little bit of resilience humor about that as well. We're all facing a great deal of ambiguity. And when we think of ambiguity, oftentimes what happens in vagueness stays in vagueness. And I bring this up because what resilience also does as the premier element of our human operating system in facing stress and overwhelm and isolation is resilience, and the 5 practices of particularly resilient people create clarity, not vagueness, around how we can be more resilient in these ambiguous moments. I talked about the simple question from which this all started. And when I asked people to think about the behaviors that they engaged in, what was born from that large data set is the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. But before I talk to you about the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, I want to disabuse you of 2 myths of resilience. The first myth is that we bounce back. So often we talk about bouncing back and we don't even think about the language that we're using here. But as humans, we are not Rubbermaid containers that spring back into form after an indentation or a challenge. In fact, what I know from my time in neuropsychology and focusing early in my career on brain injury and spinal cord injury is that our brain is reorganizing, reconstructing, reconnecting all the time. And every single experience that we have in our lives changes us. And so we never bounce back. We never go back to the way that we were before. In fact, the myth is that we bounce back. The truth of resilience is that we bounce forward. And in bouncing forward, we become an enhanced version of ourselves, and we have the opportunity to grieve and mark the things that we lost, the things that we left behind after that challenge. The second myth is that resilience is passive. We've talked during the pandemic about this idea of Netflix and chill, or time heals all wounds, and all we have to do is sit back and wait for time to pass. Well, truly, time softens things, but rather than resilience being passive, the truth of resilience is that it is active. And it's more akin to what Andy Warhol said, which is time changes things, but you have to change them yourself. And so now you know the truth of resilience, which is that we bounce forward. And it is an incredibly active process where we allow ourselves to show up for challenge, change, and complexity, and to be enhanced by these experiences, not diminished by them. Knowing that we've disabused you of these myths of resilience and that you have this definition about showing up for resilience in an active way and allowing ourselves to be enhanced, not diminished. Let's transition to the relationship between resilience and innovation. This is incredibly important right now as we think about our health, our biology, our world. What we know is that challenge, change, and complexity, stress, isolation, and overwhelm, these are trips that we take in our lives. Resilience paves the road. It evens out the potholes. It helps us as we face these anticipated and unanticipated experience. Resilience is the willingness to endure challenge, and as a result, we allow ourselves to be fundamentally and forever changed based on our experience, yielding greater curiosity and empathy, and this in its own right allows us to connect more deeply with our innovation and creativity. I want to spend some time talking with you about the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. The first practice at a high level is vulnerability, the ability to allow our inside self to match our outside self. And in doing so, we hone our human operating system, because in allowing ourselves to be congruent with our internal and external, we save energy by not running 2 operating systems. Similarly, when we're vulnerable, we allow people to see us for who we are in our moments of challenge, change, and complexity. And in doing so, we are seeded the resources, the information, the help that we need in those moments. So often it's so difficult to be vulnerable. We think that it's ugly or weak. But as Brené Brown said, what makes you vulnerable makes you beautiful. And what stands in the way of vulnerability is the shame bias. The shame bias prevents us from being vulnerable in leadership and in life. It's what tells us that if we tell people who we truly are, they won't like us, they won't love us, and they might leave. The 3 L's. They won't like us, they won't love us, and they might leave. But what we find is that the shame bias is a fallacy. It's based in fear. And when we truly do step forward into our vulnerability and share with our people and our colleagues who we truly are, not only does that allow us to be more resilient, vulnerability is truly the soil in which authenticity and empathy, or authentic leadership and empathetic leadership, grow. The second practice of particularly resilient people is the practice of productive perseverance. This is the intelligent pursuit of a goal. It's as much an art as it is a science. It's knowing when to stay the course, when to maintain the mission, and when to shift gears and move in a different direction. A lot of people talk about grit as being synonymous with resilience. Well, grit is just one facet of productive perseverance. Grit is maintaining the mission against all odds, allowing ourselves to continue in the face of challenge. Grit works really, really well when our landscape hasn't changed much, when we want to become a Navy SEAL, when we want to build a skyscraper, when we want to graduate from the Naval Academy. There's very specific checks and tests that we go through to achieve those things. But when our landscape is shifting and changing under our feet, as it is today, what we find is that it's important to pick our head up and determine, should we stay the course, should we maintain the mission? Oftentimes, maintaining the mission in the face of significant challenge and change doesn't allow us to evolve. You have only to look at the examples of Kodak and Blockbuster to see where that leads. And so it's also important for us to look specifically now at, do we shift gears? Do we pivot in a new direction? And what does that look like in terms of our goals, our strategy? Do we need to break and recreate our business model? The third practice of particularly resilient people is the practice of connection. Being able to connect deeply with ourselves as well as our external world, our colleagues, our friends. In fact, there's much research that's been done on the fact that connection promotes health and longevity. I want to tell you a story about a female leader, Mary Barra, the CEO of General Motors. She talked about creating connection as a young woman, one of few women on the factory floor, a man who wolf whistled at her and made her feel uncomfortable. But rather than rejecting him or slinking away, she went up to him and she said, "What are you doing?" And he said, "I'm merely trying to connect with you. I'm merely trying to say good morning." And so she said, "Instead, why don't you just say good morning?" And this led to a long time friendship on the factory floor. And then as Mary has risen through the ranks, she's developed greater and greater connection, both with herself and across her organization, promoting her resilience. The fourth practice of particularly resilient people is the practice of GRATI-OSITY. This is the compilation of the word for gratitude and the word for generosity. And what I found when I interviewed hundreds of leaders when they talked about their resilience is over time they were able to look on a challenge, even if it was a challenge that they wouldn't have necessarily chosen, and to say, despite the difficulty, despite the obstacle, I can see the good in that. And I can find gratitude for what I faced. And the second part of this practice of GRATI-OSITY is then, through our own vulnerability, being able to share these stories of our resilience, our resilient stories, generously with others, so that others might benefit from our lessons vicariously. And this is so perfectly captured in what Sheryl Sandberg says at a graduation ceremony, where she says to the audience on a day that is so happy and so joyful for many families as they watch their children or students engage in the process of graduating from university, she says, "My hope is that you can find gratitude, not just on the good days like today, but on the hard ones when you really need it." Being able to find gratitude in our challenges over time, and then to share our resilient stories generously with others, promotes resilience not only for ourselves, but more broadly across our communities, our organizations, and with our colleagues. The fifth and final practice of resilience is the practice of possibility. And what we find is that it's not EQ, emotional intelligence, or even IQ, our intellectual aptitude. It's becoming more and more AQ, or the adversity quotient, our ability to face challenge, to stay longer and longer in environments that present the potential for significant fear and failure. And what we find is that in the practice of possibility, those that can persevere, those that can pursue possibility or opportunity and not perfection, those are the ones with the highest adversity quotient. And in doing so, these are becoming our leaders of the future. The Chinese symbol for crisis is the character for danger and the character for opportunity. And people that navigate this practice of possibility are the ones that can both manage the opportunity inherent in any crisis as well as the danger. They are the ones who can effectively navigate that polarity to find the possibility, the innovation, the growth inherent in the challenge. I want to speak to that for just another moment on this idea of resilience and innovation. You see, one of the challenges that I've faced in my life is being dyslexic. And so being someone who's different, atypical neurally, I look very closely at words to make sure I'm pronouncing them correctly, that I'm reading the right word on the page. And what I found is that the word scared and the word sacred are basically the same word, just with the C in a different place. And what that's taught me in the wisdom of the English language is that fear is not a bad thing. In fact, fear is our greatest teacher. It's not about being fearless. It's about learning to fear less. And when we think about what scares us and what's sacred, the things that scare us are not to be avoided. The things that scare us are likely our most important and profound development opportunity. And therefore, when we face what scares us, it allows us to be more innovative and more creative, and consequently creates a virtuous cycle in bolstering our resilience. As many of you know, I served as the head of executive development at Nike for a period of time, and also head of talent strategy. And what I had the opportunity to see was, over time, how Nike had been resilient in their innovation. I loved the story of the Air Jordan 3 and how Michael Jordan almost didn't want the shoe. He'd almost signed with another company. But Nike had done its research and looked at Michael Jordan's style and what he enjoyed about the shoes that he wore on the court. And they designed something in an innovative way that wasn't just a shoe, a Nike shoe that he would wear, but a shoe that he would have the opportunity to wear that exemplified his own style. And in adding his number and specific details, Michael was so overwhelmed by the care and the innovation that was taken in creating this shoe that he signed with Nike and became an iconic ambassador to this day. As we close out today, I want to leave you with the understanding that challenge and adversity are often not something to be avoided, but something to be admired. And that usually life's greatest gifts, as Richard Paul Evans says, come wrapped in adversity. If you want to think about some micro ways that you can demonstrate resilience, I have a couple of suggestions for you. Certainly, there are the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. And we didn't have an opportunity today to go into the key behaviors that are associated with each of these 5 practices. But to review, they are vulnerability, productive perseverance, connection, GRATI-OSITY, gratitude and generosity, and possibility. But if you want a couple of resilience hacks, some quick wins, recognize that resilience also creates greater sustainability. We're all going to face challenge over time. Challenge is an inevitable aspect of the human condition. It's not if, it's when. So learning to harness our resilience allows us to be more sustainable when we face those challenges on our journey. Resilience also supports all of us in leadership and in life in navigating challenge, change, and complexity, and is primarily developed through these experiences. Resilience is about bouncing forward, allowing ourselves to be changed and formed by challenge as we actively engage, and that when we have a greater capacity for fear and failure, we can enhance our adversity quotient. We can find the possibility in the moments of danger and crisis and enhance our ability to be innovative and creative. Thank you for joining me today. I look forward to staying in touch on all of these platforms. And here's to you flourishing. When we practice the practices of resilience, these determine the 5 practices of particularly resilient people determines whether or not when we face challenge, we will flourish or fold. But know that challenge is an inherent part of our experience. And as Nelson Mandela said, do not judge me by my successes. Judge me by how many times I fell down and got back up again. It's not if we fall down on our journey. It's if we have the courage and the resilience to stand up again. Thank you so much for joining me today as part of the Health Hacking Summit. I look forward to connecting with you and hearing your impressions of the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. Take care and have a beautiful day.
We are here with Dr. Taryn Marie Stejskal, leadership expert, former head of leadership development and talent strategy at Nike, and a thought leader in the new field of resilience. And she's going to talk with us today about how resilience applies to our work lives. So over to you. You've shared a presentation as well, so we don't have to go into the full framework, but just give us a broad overview. How does resilience apply to work?
Yeah, well, what I would say, Alex, and for those of you that are tuning in, is that in this moment where we're facing sort of unprecedented challenge, change, and complexity, I think what happens is resilience is really becoming the premier skill that we need to upgrade our human operating system in order to face what we're encountering in terms of isolation, overwhelm, anxiety, fear, right? And so for me, resilience has been something that I've been passionate about for over a decade. And it just so happens that I've been conducting research and interested in this concept. And now we're at this critical moment of inflection where resilience is more important than ever. And yet it's very poorly defined, often circularly defined, right? To be resilient is to demonstrate resilience. Resilience is to be resilient. What does that even mean, right? And so as we think about resilience as it pertains to our work lives, right? Our resilient quotient, if you will, our ability to be resilient in the face of what's happening, the way that the ground is shifting under our feet, becomes the difference maker for our leadership and our ability to conduct business. And of course, okay. I talk more about that in my talk.
Great. Okay. So, and you've asked my next question for me. As someone who has been thinking about resilience and researching resilience for 10 years, what does that word encapsulate? How do you define it?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's a really important question because so often, based on my research, I fundamentally and categorically disagree with the way that people define resilience. Mm-hmm. And so the definition of resilience that's emerged for me after interviewing hundreds of leaders and collecting thousands of pieces of data is simple. It's allowing ourselves to actively engage in challenge in a way that our experience enhances us and does not diminish us.
Okay. So actively engaging in challenge in a way that enhances us, that doesn't diminish us. This, to me, sounds like a positive form of stress, a kind of stress that makes you stronger.
Yeah, I think resilience is very much related to some other concepts like healthy challenge. Right? Where we build resilience over the course of our lives, over the course of our journey. And in part, we do that by engaging in healthy challenge. There's also this concept that Malcolm Gladwell and others have talked about, which is desirable disadvantage, right? Not every adversity or obstacle is detrimental. And in fact, often adversity and obstacle and challenge are not detrimental at all. There are these desirable moments in our lives where we have the opportunity to grow. And through being able to demonstrate resilience, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, that's the inflection point, the special sauce that allows us to flourish in those moments rather than fold. Okay, so
when you're encountering a challenge, or what normal people would call a problem or a setback or some kind of issue, what is your process for converting that into a healthy challenge? How do you see it?
Yeah, well, the first part is to think about the language that we use and the story that we're telling ourselves. So if we engage in something and we're already saying to ourselves, this is a setback, what we've told ourselves is that this is something detrimental. This is something taking us off our course, requiring us to revert or retrench in some way. And so, first of all, taking stock of how we're thinking about this experience, and then the language that we're using to communicate the experience is the first step. So talking about it as a challenge, talking about it as an opportunity, right? Versus a problem or an obstacle or an adversity, because it puts us in a different frame of mind. I'm not prone to quoting Jay-Z, although I would like to quote Jay-Z much more than I do, but something
99 challenges.
That's right. Something that he said that's been meaningful is, language creates our reality. Language is power. And so if we want to be empowered in a moment of challenge, the first thing to do is to check our mindset, how we're thinking about it. And the second thing to do is to check the words that are coming out of our mouth, right? The next thing is to think about, how do I want to actively show up for this? What does success look like? If I created an outcome that I would feel positively about, what would that look like? So then we start to envision the possibility of a healthy future, of a positive outcome, versus being overwhelmed and frightened by, this challenge that's in our path.
Right. So okay, the first step is, like you said, the internal self-talk. Yeah. It's not a problem, it's a challenge. Reframe it. Make sure that, do that internally, then make sure what's coming out of your mouth speaks to that same approach.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, like doing the thought experiment of sort of zooming out and imagining where you want to be. How does that work actually? It's a thought experiment kind of thing?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, so often in business, we ask questions when we're doing consulting work or when a new project is presented to us, about like, what are the tactical steps or what are their deliverables? And many times we don't ask the question, which is, what does success look like? If we nail this project, or we deliver it with, 90 or 95% accuracy, what difference will we have created for ourselves, for our teams, for our organization? And we can do the same thing when we face challenge, right? And if that's an individual challenge, we ask ourselves that question: what does success look like for me in this moment? If it's, collective or systemic in terms of a team or an organization, we go to our teams and we go to our people and we say, okay, we're facing this challenge, right? What does success look like for us? Mm-hmm. And I think when we start to envision what success looks like, and we, individually or collectively rally around that goal, when we have a vision of the future that we want to create, we can create, our future from our future, right? And so often we use our mental energy, we use our thoughts to walk through the worst case scenario, right? To say, oh my gosh, I'm so afraid I'm going to fail. I'm so afraid this is going to happen, right? Versus really focusing our attention on what is the future that we want to create. Certainly we want to manage and mitigate risk. That's a thing. But in addition to that, having a very clear vision of, in this moment of challenge, how do I want to grow? How do I want my team to grow? What's the contribution for the organization? And when we all do this collectively, what will we have created or embedded or faced or generated, that's going to enhance, going back to the definition, right? Resilience is about being enhanced, not diminished. That's going to enhance our experience.
And make us stronger. So what I'm hearing is, these steps require a form of discipline. You have to have that discipline to adapt your thinking, the language that you use with yourself, with other people, and then have the discipline to, before you immediately start solving the problem, to take a step back and kind of do some visioneering about how things should look. A few exercises, a few scenarios. That's a kind of creative process. It's pretty, it takes a bit of discipline to have that habit. It will take some time for many people, I think. But once you've done that, what next?
I think it's important to also recognize that there will be a moment in the face of any challenge where, we have an emotional response, right? So we're talking about sort of the cognitive response, right? The thinking response. We're talking about the prefrontal cortex, right? Which is often like the best and most rational part of us. Mm-hmm. But a lot of times we get scared. Personally, if someone has a health diagnosis, we think, oh my gosh, what could happen? Or, if our organization is, losing a significant amount of revenue, right? There's a fear response, that happens in that moment. And so what I would say in terms of resilience is we don't just expect people to jump from challenge to what does success look like. There is an intervening period there where we do get to acknowledge our feelings, and we do get to be afraid, and we do get to be concerned. But if we allow that to be the full complement of our experience, if we allow a moment of vulnerability, if you will, the first practice of particularly resilient people, vulnerability, but if we allow ourselves, it's not bad to go there, right? It's okay to go there. It's if we stay there, mm-hmm. or we get stuck there, right? Where we run into trouble, right? And right. So once we've envisioned our imagined future, right? And really sort of created, we start to create our future from envisioning our future, right? We fall in love in a way then with the problem or with the challenge and the future that we're able to create in this moment. And that's when we can start to tactically draw on, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people, right? Okay. So these are the moments where we say, okay, how do I leverage vulnerability, to your point, within myself, my team, my organization, to effectively, communicate? How do I, vulnerability is another one of those squishy concepts, right? People say vulnerability to me and I'm like, I sort of know what you mean, but not totally.
You're
like
an expert.
Right? And so, vulnerability in the context of how people have demonstrated that in an effective way relative to challenge and resilience. Vulnerability is about allowing our inside self, what we're thinking and feeling and experiencing, to the extent possible, to be congruent with the outside self that we're sharing with the world, right?
Mask
and
off.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, the mask is such a great, metaphor these days, right? But, we're never going to be exactly congruent, right? There'll always be things as humans that we hold back and we don't, sort of share with everyone. But the extent to which we can get the internal operating system aligned with the external operating system that we're showing to the world, this is really resilient in 2 ways, right? One, we're expending less energy, running 2 separate systems. And 2, when we're able to effectively communicate through vulnerability, this is the soil in which, authentic leadership, empathetic leadership, right? This is fertile ground for these things to occur and to make our workplaces more humane and to engage into a greater degree with our humanity.
Lovely. Okay. So, and I see that we could easily go into the exploration of the 5 principles. What was it? The 5
practices of particularly resilient people. But we won't do that. We will not, because I did that in my talks. We won't do that here. This is different than that.
Watch the presentation. But what I'd like to do with the remaining time that we have is basically get an understanding for our audience. Now, obviously, you're doing leadership development, leadership coaching, maybe executive coaching. You're doing teams. You're doing personal coaching as well. I understand, individual coaching. Could you give our audience like an overview of how you approach an engagement in a way that like they can take some principles? It's also a little like, if someone wants to learn how to be more resilient, they can come to you. But like, it'd be interesting to share with them how you approach things, what your process is, what the outcomes are, that kind of thing. Would that be reasonable?
Yeah, absolutely. So speaking to my process relative to executive coaching, like one-on-one coaching.
And maybe teams as well, both, maybe both.
All both?
If they overlap.
Yeah, well, there is a great deal of overlap when we think about how I can characterize those side by side. So, what I'd say in terms of, executive coaching and team building, right, or team effectiveness, right? So often we talk about resilience as being an individual endeavor, right? And it is, right, for our individual resilience. And, resilience is also a team sport, right? There's a systemic, collective element of being resilient as well. So a lot of the research actually that's been done in resilience, sort of prior to me, has been about the environments that people are in, right? And whether an environment, promotes or detracts from, a person's resilience. So hospital and medical centers, right, are like a great example of this. We give our nurses and doctors, training on resilience, right? But then we put them back into like sort of this stew of long hours and reporting and, shifts and politics and, taking notes and patient care, right? That doesn't engender or promote, right, like an element of resilience. And so when we think about the executive coaching and, team resilience, team effectiveness, right, those both start from the same place, which is to do assessment and diagnostic. So we want to understand, we want to meet people where they are, and we want to understand where are people starting from, whether that's individually or from a team, from a team perspective. So
you're starting with an interview, a kind of diagnosis process where you will interview the individual, and then if it's a team, obviously the other people in the team.
That's right. Yep. So interviewing, individuals or several individuals, right? Then we want to do an assessment. So we have a proprietary.
How long is the interview?
It depends, right? On who I'm speaking to, right? So sometimes relative to executive coaching, I will have executives, CEOs, chief operating officers, reach out to me. It could also be a chief HR officer who's wanting to understand my coaching process, either for him or herself, or for the executive team, or for a number of kind of high level executives within the organization. And so those diagnostic interviews, are different, right, based on who I'm talking to. If it's a chief HR officer looking for executive or resilience coaching, right, for a number of individuals within their organization, then I'll want to understand, why these individuals, right, what are we meant to accomplish? Where are they today? Sort of what's the from to, right? Where are we starting from and where do we want to get to, at the sort of highest level, if I were to say that. And similarly with executive coaching or an executive team, right? Where are we starting from? Where are we trying to get to? And how do we imagine that resilience is going to help or pave the way for that? So I want to ask a lot of questions around, what are the strengths and the successes of the individual, the team, or the organization? And also, what are the opportunities, right? Is it engagement? Is it productivity? Is it absenteeism? Is it communication? Is it collaboration? And how, within the context of the organization, are they measuring those things, right? What is the level of absenteeism, engagement, productivity, et cetera today?
Is it being measured?
Where do they want to get to, right? And what would that mean for the organization, right? If we were to solve for this, or we were to increase productivity, reduce absenteeism, enhance engagement, how do they imagine that would positively impact or benefit, the company, the team, the individual? And then what would that mean in terms of revenue, right, for the broader organization? So those are the types of questions that I want to ask from an initial diagnostic standpoint. In addition to that, because my focus is also on leadership, we do a series of assessments for individuals and teams, right? So Alex, if you were my client, right, as an individual executive coaching client, in addition to doing that diagnostic with your chief HR officer and with you, right, what we would also do is we would do some objective assessments that have a high degree of validity and reliability.
Strengths finder.
What's that?
Strengths finder. Wild guess.
No.
No.
No, I love StrengthsFinder. At higher levels in the organization, what I find is that we need more specificity and nuance around leadership behavior. And so I use an assessment that I did not create, but it's a gold standard in our field of leadership development. And it looks at the strengths and opportunities for each leader. It looks at their motivations and drivers. And it looks at, in situations that are imperfect or when people are under pressure, where might they derail or get themselves into trouble, so we can be aware of those opportunities as well. Alongside that assessment, I'll do two other things, right? The first is we have a proprietary resilience assessment. So we actually look at people's overall resilience quotient, which I talk about in my presentation, as well as their relative strength in each of those 5 practices of particularly resilient people. And alongside that, we'll do a qualitative 360, where we'll interview that individual on their strengths and opportunities, on how they make people feel in meetings or when they walk into the room, back when doing things in person was a thing, right? Now it's
how do you make people feel when you log into the Zoom?
That's right. The question has changed, right? Like when this person logs into the Zoom, how do they make people feel, right? Like what's sort of the tenor of that interaction? So understanding those things, both in terms of how they see themselves and in terms of how others see them. And then what we're able to do is to find those intersection points around what is the diagnostic in terms of what we're meant to accomplish here? What are this person's leadership strengths and development opportunities objectively relative to this assessment that has a high degree of validity? What is their, sort of resilience quotient? And then how do other people in the organization see them alongside how they see themselves, right? And for a team, we would just, do that for each individual on the team, and then also think about that aggregate or sort of team level based of reporting on that information.
Right. Okay. So I'm sensing a very involved process that could take weeks, depending on the size of the team. So you collect the data, you aggregate it, you process it on your side, you deliver this is where we are sort of report, and then you would have to go about intervening to improve on the points you've identified. Is that accurate?
It's accurate except for one piece, which is, now thanks to technology, we're able to collect this information in a week, right? Okay. And analyze it, within, hours or days, right? Because what person as a leader, what organization has like weeks, to like go through this process, right? Like we need to move now, right? When the pandemic hit, one of the organizations that I had the privilege of working with was Kraft Heinz. And, they had to figure out how to get, macaroni and cheese and ketchup on the shelves, tomorrow, as their distribution channels and warehouse policies and procedures were shifting, sort of moment by moment relative to COVID. So, thanks to technology, we can collect this qualitative information, right, very quickly in an electronic survey. The assessment data is instantaneous once the person completes the assessment, and then we also hit a button and aggregate reports. And so it all needs to happen very quickly, at the speed of change that's occurring for us as individuals, as leaders, and at the company level.
Well, one thing that I'd like to bring this or relate this to is our audience, which is an audience of biohackers. And these are people who are very comfortable with quantified self. And I like the idea of comparing these kinds of interventions to our own individual biohacking, where you start by measuring your metrics, your stress levels, your heart rate variability, your sleep patterns, etc. You get the baseline, and then you're like, okay, now I need to work on that sleep. You take some supplements, you do some practices to improve your sleep quality, and then I see this as being a very parallel kind of activity with the organization as an organism. It's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think similar to what you're sharing, Alex, is from that place, there isn't necessarily like a silver bullet, right? There's both an art and a science. And so for another individual that I worked with who wants to focus on their ability to connect with their team, say, and their communication skills, or their ability to move out of a tactical sort of level, trust their team, delegate, and get more to a strategic place, as an executive, that's the what, of the engagement. And then with each person, part of the art is how we're going to get there. And with that information, we understand a great deal about, each individual and each individual on a team. And then we're able to put together a thoughtful plan for what is that journey to achieve our goals and get to a place where we're truly then solving, even for individual coaching, solving at an enterprise level, right, for greater productivity or engagement or communication or leadership.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Very nice. Very nice. Okay. So I'm sorry to take you down that rabbit hole. I think it's very helpful for people to understand how to apply these kinds of ideas, how you work, etc. Let's go back in wrapping up to your presentation. Could you give us an overview of the presentation? What do we expect there?
Yeah, so when you engage with the presentation, there's a couple of things that will happen. I'll talk about how I was inspired to conduct my research over a decade ago. I'll talk about the simple but powerful question that I began asking leaders to understand their resilience and how that gave birth to, if you will, the 5 practices of particularly resilient people. What those practices each are, and at a high level, I think because it's just 25 or 30 minutes, what those look like in practice. If folks want more information on specific behaviors or how we would coach to that, I'm glad to provide that as a follow-up. There's also a number of myths that surround resilience. So, I read articles all the time that talk about, bouncing back, and a fast recovery, right, from challenge. And these are the hallmarks of resilience. And in fact, those are not the hallmarks of resilience. So I spend a little bit of time discussing the myths and truths of resilience. And spoiler alert, the myth is that we bounce back, we go back to a prior state. And the truth is that we bounce forward. We're fundamentally and forever changed by all of our experiences, challenge especially. And then we round out the time talking a bit more about resilience as an inflection point relative to innovation and creativity in moments of challenge. We've got resilience in a bottle at the end, or sort of the biohacker approach. Like, if I don't have time to kind of completely
resilience spray.
If I don't have time to completely retool my vulnerability or the connection that I have with others, what are a couple of things that I can do in the moment that are going to allow me to kind of hack into my resilience? One that I didn't mention that I'll mention here that's been tremendously important in the pandemic as we think about moving from in-person to virtual teams. It's a small thing, but it's a big thing. It's assume positive intent.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, that's huge. It's been huge for people's resilience, right? Like that person who's like standing too close to you in the grocery line because like none of us know where we're supposed to stand in the grocery store. That's like not a work example. Or, internet being down, or like kids running around while you're on like a work Zoom call. Is like assume positive intent. We're all doing the best we can. And if people are not doing the best they can, it's a very small subset of the population.
Can I give you an extension on that idea? Hanlon's razor. Have you heard of Hanlon's razor?
No, I've heard of Occam's razor, but not
Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is most likely to be the true one, or the accurate one. Hanlon's razor is never attribute to malice what can easily or equally be attributed to stupidity. It's a bit cheeky.
That's not quite where I was going with that, but I appreciate that you brought it in. For those of you listening in, do not listen to what he said.
Yeah. I just putting my my spice on it. There we go. Thank you very much.
I loved your spice.
Thank you, thank you. Look, I would like to wrap up by zooming out what we've just discussed, your life's work, etc. What is the big idea? If you could choose one idea, what would be the one idea that you would want to share with our audience?
That challenge is a fundamental element of our human experience. And so often when we run into challenge, we think, crap. This is not what I was planning. This is not what I wanted. And for many of us, we personalize that challenge. We say, I must have not done something right. I didn't tick and tie all the things. I wasn't strategic enough to have anticipated, the way the market was going to shift and change. And to recognize that challenge is inevitable for all of us. It's not if, it's when. And that challenge is part of our human growth, part of our development, right? Like we're the clay on the potter's wheel, challenge is the potter, we are the clay, and it's forming us all along the way. And so often we think like, I don't want to be formed anymore. I don't need to build any more character, right? But the alternative is like we get fired in the kiln, and then we are, static, right? We're not dynamic.
When you fall off the table.
You fall off the table and it's bad and doesn't go well. So, remember that, one, challenge is inevitable. It's not if, it's when, right? Two, don't personalize the challenge, right? We're all meant to face challenge as humans to grow and to be formed. And that challenge is not the period at the end of the sentence. It's not the end of the story. Challenge is the comma that invites us, and says like, do you want to keep doing this? Do you want to continue to be a part of what you're doing? What does it mean to you? And that's a key moment of inflection where we get to decide in the face of challenge, right? If this is the path that we truly want to be on.
Beautiful. Okay, well, thank you for sharing. Thank you for your time, for your contribution. It's been a pleasure. And we look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you. I look forward to it too. Ciao.